Leslie Halleck gets excited about small things. Well, and about big things too. She's a degreed, certified professional horticulturist known for her boundless curiosity and passion across the horticultural board. And she knows how to teach us. Her first two books are on my go-to shelf for constant reference: Gardening Under Lights and Plant Parenting, easy ways to make more houseplants, vegetables, and flowers. In her latest book, Tiny Plants, discover the fun and fascination of growing and collecting itty-bitty houseplants. Leslie, it's really good to see you, even though we're 200 miles apart.
Yes, well, I mean, we're both still in Texas, so we're sort of together.
So, what is this thing about tiny plants? Exactly what are they?
When you grab my new book, Tiny Plants, Discover the Joys of Growing and Collecting Itty Bitty Houseplants, you will, in the preface, read a little bit of my origin story, because that's usually the question I get asked first is, why are you obsessed with tiny plants and what are they? So I give you a little bit of history and background on how I became obsessed with tiny plants and what they are. So when I talk about tiny plants, I'm really talking about genetically miniature species of plants. We're not talking about artificially controlling plant size. Like bonsai is a perfect example of artificially training a plant to stay smaller than it would normally, or growth regulators that get used in the commercial industry to keep plants smaller. We're not talking about any of that. We're talking about plant species that are truly itty bitty at mature size, and that's how they grow in their natural environment. So these are plants that, if you don't have a lot of space, can really make indoor gardening a lot easier for you. Obviously, over the last year and a half or so, everybody's really been cooped up inside, and sort of the latest wave of houseplant enthusiasm was already happening before. We all got kind of shut in. And for folks who have limited space, maybe they're living in apartments, or just don't have a lot of space to keep plants. Maybe they don't have a lot of natural light, but they want to bring some nature. They want to cultivate something. They want to engage in that relationship where they're caring for and cultivating nature and houseplants. Tiny plants give you the perfect opportunity to do that. You can keep hundreds of species of tiny plants in a few square feet of space, unlike those big monstera and philodendron that everybody's discovered take up tons of space, right? Tiny plants and tiny indoor gardening can be less overall maintenance for you, less cleanup, less resources. And so if you want to keep plants and collect plants, or maybe, you've got a bunch of big house plants and you just don't have room to collect more, but you want to keep collecting new plant species, I have given you the perfect excuse, the perfect way to do it. By keeping it tiny, you can add tons of plants to your collection. So it's a great way to indulge your plant hobby, if you will, and keep going and keep growing. I think it's important to understand sort of why plants grow the way they do, which is going to help you better grow them indoors. Tiny plants have evolved special strategic advantages in terms of how they consume resources that enables them to be able to better compete in their natural environment. And that may be that tiny leaves don't take as much energy to produce. Plants use light to stimulate photosynthesis, and it takes a lot of energy to generate big tropical leaves, right? It can also be hard to cool or keep warm very large leaves in a natural environment. So tiny plants have sort of a strategic advantage. I go into a few different categories of plants, and obviously that's a big deep dive that we don't have time to get into today. But I will teach you the differences between terrestrial plants, plants that have a root system in the soil, in the ground, and that's where they absorb their water and nutrients for the most part. We talk about epiphytes, which have root systems that are above ground, right? They're going to be a lot of orchids and things like that grow on branches and surrounding plant material. And then we get into a few categories like lithophytes and chasmophytes that may grow on, in, penetrate, or in between rocks. There's a lot of carnivorous plants and orchids that grow in that fashion. And we also get into aquatic plants, right, that grow either fully submerged or immersed, meaning their root system and part of the plant might be under the water, but they might have foliage above the water. Water lilies are a great example of that. So I break down each of those categories for you because obviously how the plant grows in its natural environment needs to be replicated in an indoor environment. There are a lot of plants that kind of fall in between, and I go into hemiepiphytes, which is a category you'll find represented a lot in the book. Plants that can grow either as epiphytes or terrestrial plants at different stages of their development. And so those plants give you the ability to grow them in lots of different ways, especially under glass or in terrariums as mounted specimens, whereas you might typically grow them in a pot outside of glass. I have a penchant for pottery and glass vessels and vintage containers. I love to collect, and I think this is one of the big advantages of tiny plants is that they allow you to get really creative with the vessels you grow them in and glass containers that you use that you otherwise would never be able to utilize with big plants. Some itty bitty tiny plants, some of the tiniest plant species I grow, pygmy sundews are a great example, and that's a carnivorous plant that I feature in the book. The plant is about the size of my fingernail, but the roots can be 5 or 6 inches long. So even though it's a tiny plant, you may need a very tall, deep container to accommodate the root system. So it's deceiving. Whereas other plants, many succulents that may be larger, may have a very shallow root system, and you only need, an inch or two worth of depth to accommodate that root system. So again, like the categories of plants we talked about, epiphytes, terrestrial epiphytes, understanding how that plant's root system works in terms of how much space it needs and how much access to constant moisture it needs, right? Also determines whether you use porous vessels, porous containers that can breathe and drain, or you can get away with using grandma's teacup. And I show you in the book, you'll see I have some plants growing in teacups, even without drainage, if they're plants that grow in typically wet, boggy conditions, right? Like some of the other carnivorous plants, bladderworts are a great example. You can reuse and repurpose lots of different types of containers. And when you start getting into some of my favorite species, Syningias are a great example. You can grow a full-size mature plant in a container the size of a thimble, in an actual thimble. That's literally all the space they need. So it's really fun to get creative with using canning jars, teacups, concrete handmade vessels. You can get really creative, but it's all about the size of that plant's root system and how much moisture or how much drainage and aeration it needs. And again, I'm always going to throw you back to a little bit of science and tell you to research where that plant grows naturally, what type of environment, what type of soils does it grow in naturally, and that's what you have to try to replicate as best you can in a container in an indoor environment. Certainly succulents, like this teeny tiny Haworthia angustifolia. This is full size, like it's a whole colony. This is in a porous handmade concrete pot with a drainage hole with a very loose, grainy, rocky succulent mix, right? That water, you want it to drain away. You don't want it to sit, and you want that root system to be able to breathe, whereas something that I grow, under glass that likes a lot of humidity and wet moisture, I keep in a non-porous container that I might use a soil mixture that can hold more moisture, that maybe it has more core in it, something that's going to soak up moisture and hold onto it. So you'll often find potting mixes, which are usually inert, meaning they don't have organic matter in them, labeled for different plants. Orchid mix or succulent mix, African violet mix is an excellent option for any of your gesneriads, whether you're growing begonias, African violets, Syningia, gloxinias. All of those can be very well grown in something called an African violet mix or similar, because it's going to both hold moisture but also allow it to drain. So each type of plant is going to thrive in a different type of growing media. And you'll find that some of the plants I get into in, say, the high humidity under glass can be successfully grown just in moss, in sphagnum moss or in moss, because they're epiphytes or hemiepiphytes that don't need a root system that lives in soil. So again, deciding on the growing media that you're using depends on the natural physiology of that plant, its morphology, and where it grows. So yes, growing media is very important, because if you put a succulent that, like a lithops or something that really needs barely any moisture at the root zone, in something that holds moisture, say for an African violet, boy, you could rot that plant very quickly. So growing media is just as important as the growing vessel. And that's true for all your plants, not just tiny house plants. The cool thing about growing tiny plants is that it's so much easier to light them artificially indoors because all you need is a single bookshelf of space. And there's so many great little new LEDs out there that you can undermount that are perfect for growing all of these tiny plants, whether they're succulents or gesneriads, whatever they are. That can be harder to do with bigger houseplants. You need bigger lights that have a lot more power to really keep a lot of big leafy plants happy. All you need is a single bookshelf. So some of the smaller wattage, like the 20 to 30 watt LED grow lights that are out there, are not always really powerful enough for your bigger houseplants, but they're perfect for tiny plants. So for tiny foliage plants, if you're looking, I'm going to give you a very general recommendation here that's not scientific, but about 20 watts of power per 2 square feet of space is about what you need. And you can leave that light on about 10 hours to 12 hours a day. That's a very general recommendation if you're keeping a group of tiny plants on a bookshelf, on a table away from the window. Of course, if you've got nice, bright southern eastern light in your windowsills and you've got space, that's going to be great for a lot of your tiny plants, right? But if you don't have a lot of natural light, that's the cool thing about tiny plants is it's so much easier to use a lot of the artificial grow lights out there because you just don't need as much power. I actually also give you an ideal light exposure, whether that's north, east, south, or west, because each of those window exposures are going to deliver a very different quantity of light that also changes seasonally. Obviously, in the winter, light levels go way down, the sun angle goes down, and your photo period shortens. The number of hours of light we have per day shortens, right? So that's obviously a big change. However, many plants are naturally evolved to sort of have periods of resting time. When the photo period shortens, when temperatures cool down, they're going to slow down their growth, right? So that's kind of normal. Now, if you have a west facing window that gets, say, 4 or 5 hours of hot, direct sun, I'm not going to put my little button fern, which is one of my favorite low humidity windowsill ferns, tiny ferns you can grow, which there are not many of those. This one's going to go in an east or north facing window. It's not going to like that hot, direct afternoon sun. It'll burn. Now, on the other hand, my little lithops, my little living stones, or my little, Groptophyllums, those are very happy in a western exposure with hot, direct sun. It's all about the species that you're growing. I have plant profile features broken out for you, right? And I have those in 2 different chapters. One is your windowsill plants, and those are your low humidity plants. Those are the plants that can tolerate being out in normal low 30 to 50% household, relative humidity. The plants that are featured in the under glass section are going to be your high humidity species. These tiny plants, if left out in the open under the windowsill, not going to last very long. Now, this book is not a terrarium building book. And I want to distinguish when I'm talking about growing under glass, I mean a lot of things besides direct planting in a terrarium. So my definition of a terrarium is an enclosed environment where you are directly planting, right, your plant species into that environment. And that can be a little bit more complicated, right? That can be, you've got to create drainage layers, maintenance can take you a little longer to learn. What I do in tiny plants is give you some extra options about how to grow potted high humidity plant specimens under cloche, which are glass bell jars or glass canning jars, or pretty much any glass vessel that you can find without having to get really complicated with planting a terrarium. So you can keep, and here's a little example. I have one of my favorite little tiny, and I'll open it up for you, Syningias. This is a micro Syningia. It's a little blooming gesneriad, and I squished some of the blooms getting in here, but isn't this cool? This is a beautiful handmade glazed pot. It's 1 inch. This is a fully mature plant. I've even got some cool seed pods on there that I can propagate. You can get into plant parenting if you want to learn how to do that. But left out in the open, this plant would dry up. Now, you can plant Syningia directly into terrariums. However, you have to be very careful with sort of drainage and make sure they don't stay soggy. So I find as a collector, I want to see my individual plant species. So I do that by covering them with glass cloches or setting them inside canning jars or whatever kind of cool glass vessels I find. And I'll tell you what, those plants that I have growing under glass are probably my lowest maintenance plants. If you don't open up that glass very often, you don't have to do what very often? water. So it actually is great if you ever get back to traveling a lot, or you're out of the house, or you're maybe a forgetful waterer. Growing some potted specimens under glass cover is an awesome way to kind of set it and forget it. But what I really wanted to do with tiny plants is introduce people to a whole new world of plant species they may never have ever seen before. Didn't realize there were all these tiny plant species that they could cultivate and grow indoors, and show you how to decorate with them, because that's the other cool thing. You can move your tiny plants around a whole lot easier than you can your big stuff, right? The big stuff is kind of set where it has to stay to be happy, but little things you can use to decorate. And the other thing is you'll learn to hunt for these tiny plant species. You're not going to find a lot of these plants at sort of your general garden center. Some of them you will, but I also introduce you to a whole world of growers who grow plants specifically for vivariums, right? Vivariums are terrariums that also house animals, right? That match the plants with the animals. So aquatic suppliers, aquascaping growers, vivarium growers, there's a whole world of growers out there that grow amazing, cool little plant species and micro orchids that are sort of outside the normal shopping realm of a typical home hobbyist or gardener. I'm most active on Instagram, so at Leslie Halleck on Instagram. I'll talk about outdoor gardening, indoor gardening, grow lighting, propagation. I always try to drop in sort of what I call my botanical factoid of the day, give you a little bit of information and a little learning, and show you what I'm growing and what I have going on. So at Leslie Halleck, same thing on Twitter, at Leslie Halleck. I have a couple of Facebook groups, Plant Parenting and Gardening Under Lights. And of course, you can find everything, contact me, and get signed copies of my book at my website, and that's lesliehalleck.com.